Well, welcome back once again to Talking with Tech. My name is Lucas Stuber, joined by my friend Rachel Madel. How are you doing, Rachel?
I'm really good. How are you guys doing?
Really well. How about yourself, Chris Begay?
I'm fantastic. I can't wait to hear what we have to going on today.
Yeah, this is a pretty exciting one. So, when we say talking with tech, obviously there's a little bit of a play on words there. I think we SLPs like to play with words. And usually what that means is literally talking with technology, right? So we talk about augmentative and alternative communication for people who, maybe lack oral speech for whatever reason. But in this case, we're actually just talking about apps for educational technology, which is fun because there's so many of them. There's a lot of them are a ton of fun, and it's one of the fastest growing fields that's out there. I mean, if you look on the iTunes App Store, education is, well, I think actually maybe it's Toca Boca has taken over the world, right? Is that the main one that I see?
Toca Boca has taken over my practice for sure.
Yeah. What about Starfall? That's another one that I see all the time. Where if I see Stack the States one more time, I'm going to stack myself out a window. But,
also Sega Mini. You guys familiar?
Oh yes, yes, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have this policy of going through and buying not buying, but I get like the top 10 free education apps every week in the store just to see, because you got to keep up on the trends, right? You got to know what people are referring to, and boy, that makes me hip sometimes. Like I know all about Roblox, for example. Like this is which is like Minecraft ripoff with light, But, the kids love me for it, and I guess that makes me a better clinician. But, I mean, how do we feel about this, right? I mean, there's a lot of issues with educational gaming and gaming for children. I mean, one of the ones that's been getting a lot of press recently is the idea of in-app purchases for games, right? Which have been considered predatory in some cases and have even been ruled as gambling in Europe and Australia and certain places. But more specific to our profession, when we have a student who is using a device that's maybe is on their IEP as an accommodation for communication or for keyboarding, should that device then also have these educational games on them, no matter what the merit is?
I am constantly talking to parents and teams about this exact thing because iPads are everywhere. Children have access a lot of times to YouTube and their favorite games. So when you put a device in front of them and it's not their favorite game or their favorite YouTube channel, then sometimes there's a lot of behaviors that go along with that. And so one of the ways to remediate that is to use one device only for communication. And, obviously that's a best case scenario. Not everybody can afford to have one iPad for just communication and an iPad for just games. But I really do see a huge difference in the clients that I work with having one device. What do you guys think?
So I think there's a very, very simple, short answer for this, and that is no. You should not have multiple apps on your communication device necessarily, especially when you're first starting. There was some controversy a little bit when the iPads were allowed to have a split screen so that you could have one app open and have a second app open. But I think that just impacts the motor planning. So often I think you have to have your dedicated communication device, and then that's what you use to talk about the thing that you're doing on your other device, right? So how do you talk about the video trailer you're watching, the YouTube video you're watching? How do you talk about the game you're playing? Is that you use your dedicated device to talk about that. So you really need a two-device system.
And you're exactly right. Chris, the moment that you pull up something else on the iPad, you lose all communication, unless you have a user that's able to navigate back and forth. But 9 times out of 10, even for the children that I work with who are able to navigate back and forth, they're just so engrossed in what they're doing. They're like, I don't want to talk right now. I just want to watch YouTube. So leave me alone, Rachel.
Right. Well, A few things on that. So first of all, Chris, it's magical when you have a student that has a communication, an iPad for communication and an iPad for either education or recreation, because it's so cool. It provides so many opportunities for commenting, for all this other sort of ancillary communication that happens alongside the game. Like I could talk about Minecraft for a really long time with kids. And
let's do it. Let's talk about whatever.
Well, and you know what? We could talk about Minecraft with core words. In fact, listeners out there, I've actually been contemplating creating a control scheme for Minecraft using nothing but core words, and I'm pretty sure I could do it.
Welcome to the Minecraft show with Rachel and Lucas and Chris.
I don't want to be a part of this show. I know nothing about Minecraft. I don't want to be grouped into this Minecraft show.
Yeah. Oh, Rachel, you have to, because it's up and down and in, and you go into the game. It's totally core vocabulary. Just
all right, fine.
All these classic core words like creeper and squid. Now, another thing that you brought up is I agree with you on the split screen piece, but I will say that from the recreational or educational side, I use that quite a bit, especially I really like the app time timer, right? So if somebody, say, earns a break on not their communication iPad, but the other iPad, then that's a good way for them to keep track. But all that being said, the ultimate weapon, in my opinion, where, Rachel, you just said that maybe the student doesn't want to discontinue a preferred activity, which is the polite way of saying, give me back my movie, is guided access with a timer. And boy, I love that. And one thing I love about it is it takes the agency away from me. Right. So I'm not wrestling the iPad away. The iPad itself decided to stop playing that movie. And for whatever reason, that makes a big difference.
It makes a huge difference. I actually made a YouTube video on this exact issue because all these parents were like, they're so good about the iPad with you, Rachel. Like, you pull out their favorite game and then they just they stop playing it and they put the iPad away. Like, we can't get the same level of, compliance. And I'm like, listen, it's called guided access. There's a timer function. The iPad shuts down and there's nothing they can do about it. I'm like, oh no, the iPad shut down. Oh, I'm so sorry. It's time to go.
Oh, I thought that was because you're just not as cool as 12-year-old Lucas. So when you seem interested, they're not interested anymore, I'm kidding. But yeah, that's a huge tool in our arsenal. And I'm really happy that I think it was as recently as iOS 6 or 7 that they actually added guided access. And to think about how much we use that now. And we could do a whole episode. And I don't know, Rachel, you've made videos about how to do that. There's all kinds of little tricks, like when you turn on guided access, using your finger to circle certain parts of the screen that can't be accessed anymore. Some really neat things. But the bigger question at play here is this concept of the communication device. Now, before we started recording, one distinction I wanted to make was between an iPad that's used only for communication and the concept of a dedicated device. What is the difference?
Well, I think a dedicated device is for communication. So it's dedicated. That's what the dedicated adjective means in that regard, is that it is dedicated to be my voice, my language system, my way of communicating, my expressive language, where the other iPad would be to do everything else.
So that's interesting, because that actually is a slightly different interpretation than what I've heard. So listeners, if you have a thought on this, shoot us an email, tech@speechscience.org. We'd love to hear your thoughts, or of course search for us on Facebook. If you look for Talking with Tech, we've got the group there. We'd love to hear your thoughts. But what I've always heard a dedicated device referred to is the old Accent or the VMAX or the dedicated big brick device that literally cannot be used for anything other than communication because it doesn't have the capacity to be, whereas an iPad, ostensibly, yeah, you can get out of that app, or get out of guided access and get into the rest of the stuff. But the more I have this conversation with you guys now, I don't really know a better term.
Yeah, well, I think that it's just now with the iPad being so pervasive, we can create dedicated devices with an iPad.
Okay, all right. I cede the point. 1 point to Chris, 1 minus point to Rachel for not knowing Minecraft. You lose.
Hey!
I win.
How did this this happen?
No, wait a second. I'll give you a point for the guided access timer bit.
Yeah, okay, all right, that was good.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So here's a wrench, and I can think of one situation in which I have done this, but when, if ever, would it be appropriate to allow someone outside of their dedicated device?
I think maybe using email or some other function that is communication related. That just floated into my mind.
No, good. That's exactly one of the ones I was thinking of, is to access communication via some other modality. Like a lot of apps now have the ability to push out, just like Apple sharing, like to SMS or to email app. Now, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, I think at that point, though, you were talking about someone who is a skilled user. There's some sort of threshold they crossed where they have, they're like advanced in that. At least most of the people that I'm working with, they're just learning how to use a communication device. And most of the teachers that I'm working with are just learning to teach students how to use a communication device. So it's so ultra rare that I would find that we would use it for some other function. I thought, as you were asking that question, I was thinking, well, maybe like taking pictures of my environment so I could talk about the stuff that I did this weekend, so you'd know that I went to the library. And nope, I think I'd still use a second device rather than taking pictures, So
yeah, okay.
It's so rare.
I see what you're saying. So the other two that I was thinking of, and I think you pretty much hit them both, but one is a conversation that I just had today about the Grid 3 specifically in relation to home automation for like adults with ALS and things like that it'll communicate to these sort of smart systems for lights and that sort of thing. So that's pretty, like you say, that's pretty esoteric. That's a pretty high level application. But another one that I've done before actually was for activities of daily living with a very medically fragile student using an eye gaze system, where I was able to have the system call out a YouTube video in a pop-up window that then would close if she oriented away from it. And at the time, it was quite a debate. It was, should we be doing this, or should we be having her request the video and then carting over another system to show it to her? In this case, I stand by the decision. I think that I valued her autonomy in making those decisions around ADLs more than the communicative function of the device. Do you think I was right doing that?
Yeah, it's her choice, right? I mean, totally. It's totally about making it student-centered or person-centered, so that if they can make the choices on their own, then yes, totally, it's up to you, man. Right? It's yours. It's your way of communicating. So I think it definitely falls on them.
I actually I posted the video that we made for guided access on one of the Facebook groups. I think it was like speech pathologists at large. It was one of the really big ones, and someone had a very strong response against guided access, saying that
really
children should be able to listen to parents or teachers, when they're given the command, you have to stop watching in 5 minutes, or, give me the iPad or whatever it is. And we shouldn't be relying on technologies like guided access. So it was crazy because it went like, I think it was like 50 comments, like everybody was like combating back and forth. But I thought that was interesting.
So go back and read it. Are you sure that wasn't me? No, the reason I say that is because so often I feel like we do jump to guided access without teaching a student why to use it. You know what I mean? So I often use this analogy of what's least restrictive, and so how do the students learn to behavior regulation unless they have opportunities to do that? Now, maybe guided access is not the place to teach it. Maybe their communication device is not the way. There's plenty of other times to learn behavior regulation, but I do think that there's something to that that maybe we start with, okay, we're going to keep it unlocked, and every time you start you navigate away from it and you don't follow the direction, that's an onus to start to, maybe I do have to turn on guided access and then turn on the feature where it times out in a certain time. But sometimes I think we should start without guided access and then prove that you need to use it. Does that make sense?
I completely agree. And I also think you brought up an excellent point, Chris, in that we need to explain the rationale to children why we're doing the things that we're doing. You know what I mean? And even if, we don't think that they necessarily understand, I still think that it's a conversation worth having. We're just so quick to, and this, we could have a whole nother conversation about operational competence and being able to operate my device and turn it on and charge it and all these other things. But I think we're just so quick to jump in and kind of manhandle these devices without explaining to kids why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah. No, this is good. Since we're awarding points today, I'm gonna give a point to Gryffindor here, Chris, because that was a very good point. And I'm reflecting on this because one thing I harp on and I teach and I've written about all the time is that if you take away, for example, a student's device to do some programming or to make an alteration, you ask permission. Right. Mm-hmm. And you tell them what you're doing, whether or not they know what that means. Like, you always ask permission because that is their property and you want to reinforce that over time. And when we talk about least restrictive environment, I think people tend to go to the idea of physical autonomy or physical seclusion. But there is also this element of sort of communicative or cognitive seclusion that I guess I was just making a case for, and now I'm regretting it. So that's what these podcasts are for, right? Shoot us an email, tech@speechscience.org. I want to hear what you guys have to say, because this is a train of thought that I hadn't gone down before, and I know for a fact that guided access and the practices that we're talking about right now are widespread in the schools, certainly.
Yeah, it's not a question of whether you use it or not. It's where you start. Do you start by turning on guided access, or do you start by not and then moving to turn it on because the student has shown you that they need to? And I think I'd love to hear what people's opinions on where they start and why they do that, do it the way they do it.
And I actually have a child that I work with who I do that exact thing. So I have like a board, and if I put an X on it every time he escapes a vase, which is the program that he uses. And when he gets to 5, I'm like, yeah, yay, a vase. But when he gets to 5 X's, I'm like, all right, guided access, my man. I'm sorry. Like, we can't watch YouTube right now. And that's how I handle it. But he always starts with an opportunity to not have it on.
Yeah, Rachel, you're teaching him, right? You're teaching him. That's a teaching strategy. That's awesome. She wins.
I won.
Well,
we already said Gryffindor. I don't really see you as like a Hufflepuff or a I don't know. You can both be Gryffindor.
We'll just have
I'll be Slytherin over here, or Slytherin. I'm gonna be.
We'll have to do a tiebreaker after the break.
Well, today, so I'm really excited about today's interview. So we have Jayne Clare on from Teachers with Apps, who has an amazing blog where she is just incredibly prolific, reviewing all these different apps and pieces of software that can be used in the classroom. She has a really well thought out rubric by which she evaluates them, and this was a really informative conversation for us. So I want to jump into it in a second, but before I do. Is there anything you guys have been liking recently? Educational apps you've used with your students, or something you've downloaded that you were impressed by?
Okay, yeah, totally. So you know what I've been playing with lately are any sort of avatar making app where you like get a face and you put the eyes on it and put the nose and the mouth, and it's so much engaging for students, and it's so great like for teaching certain core vocabulary like on and happy and smile and emotions, So that's anything like that has been awesome. Like just yesterday we were playing with one. Emoji Me. It's kind of like Bitmoji, but it's just a knockoff of Bitmoji where it's exactly that. You can create a face. It's cool.
That's cool. That reminds me of for the 10 people in the world that bought an iPhone X, the Animojis that they came out with, which I've used a little bit with students. That's always pretty fun. The one that I like that's free that just came out on iOS and Android is called Google Primer. Google actually put this out, and it's just called Primer, like Primer. And the tagline is "Learn new skills fast." And so all it is little 5-minute exercises for adults that teach you about business, marketing, networking, so the sort of stuff that I have to force myself how to learn. All right. Well, without taking too much more time, let's get to it. I'm excited to introduce to you Ms. Jayne Clare. Well, welcome back to Talking with Tech. My name is Lucas Stuber, joined as always by my colleague Rachel Madel. How are you?
Great.
And today we're super excited to be joined by Ms. Jayne Clare of Teachers with Apps. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited about it.
I'm thrilled you joined us because, as of course, I think you know, there's a whole glut of sites out there that do reviews of educational apps that may or may not have as much trustworthiness as what you've done in terms of transparency and accountability and advertising and these other things. But I guess just a place to start is tell us a little bit about yourself and why you've done what you've done.
Sure. I never thought I'd be a teacher for very long. I thought I'd teach a little bit, get it out of my system, and decide what I wanted to be when I grew up. Well, 30 years later, still teaching special ed. And I loved what I did. I got my second master's in technology because I'd always wanted to do some sort of scavenger hunt type of thing, maybe for the smart board or something like that.
Wow.
And in 2009, I started with a partner, Ann Rachel. She was a great artist and a preschool teacher. And we started putting this program together for reading readiness. And it was something that I had been using in my class that seemed to really work, where the child was learning the letter ID, the letter sound, and something that was associated that, such as apple. Doing this in the summer, I'm still teaching. My son's home from college. A friend walks by. He goes, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, we're making a computer program." He goes, "Why don't you make an app?" I said, "What's that?" So 9. I didn't even have a smartphone.
That's great.
And I had a phone, but not whatever. So we said, okay. He showed us what an app was, and we morphed into 2009 making our first app, which was a reading readiness app. We were really challenged by working with the developers themselves because we had specific criteria for how things looked, sounded, and we also went to the extent where even if a movement such as R was for rain, we'd make sure that it would be coming down when the rain dropped with the animation. Okay, so fast forward, we tried a few other apps and didn't really have competition. It was 2009. Cookie Doodle was really the number one, month after month after month. And you make a cookie, eat it, and that was the extent of it. So we thought, when we got what was called ABC Shakedown on the iPhone, we said, golden. I mean, I just couldn't believe it was exactly what I wanted. And I thought it was going to be such a great tool. And we very quickly learned not that easy.
Yeah, I know. It's deceptively easy. Well, in the time you're talking about, too, this is all before, Stack the States and some of these other things that have consistently topped the charts, right?
Right. This is pre-iPad, and this is really early on. I got panned by Warren Buckleitner from Children's Technology Review. I remember talking to him on the phone in my classroom and being just devastated because he said he didn't like some of our pictures, our illustrations. I'm like, well, the I is for itch because we want the child to touch their arm and say, I'm very good friends with him now, so that's why I'm allowed to say that. But we didn't have any experience in marketing. We had no experience even in defending ourselves when people would say, "Why, what's this all about?" So we kind of got our feelings hurt and didn't move forward. And in retrospect, I'm so glad that I'm not in the app market and that we did not have a success there, because I have seen it change so drastically. It's just been a fun journey. We morphed into teachers with apps. We said someone needs to be curating and finding the best and writing about them for teachers, parents, anyone in the digital space that was interested in finding the content, the great content on their devices.
That's
so that
great.
was right around 10 that we started that.
Well, and so you're speaking, I can parse out at least 3 different challenges, right? And one of them is the challenge of being a developer in this field, where you may or may not get, unwelcome criticism or constructive criticism. And, of course, there's always things I think anyone can do better in this area. But, but also the relative proliferation of apps in education, and your need really to curate that to a large extent. And I don't know, do you work at all in the Android market, or is it iOS?
We do, because we have a number of teachers spread out throughout the different areas, such as we have a speech pathologist and an occupational therapist and a math and an English ESL. So yes, we do some Android now, because for a while it wasn't worth it, but now it's caught up, and so is Google Play.
Great. Well, and how do you approach I guess, again, that curation piece? Like, how do you decide what to review and what not to? Are you brought things by developers, or are you constantly scouting?
Well, basically, because we do a thorough review, we field test all apps with children and teachers, and we write our review with that in mind. We don't just cut and paste from iTunes and give it a star or however many stars. We spend the time, and if the first few minutes we find it's really lacking some key components, then we write to the developer and say, we're sorry, but at this time we'd make a few suggestions that we cannot be reviewing your app. And then the ones that were great, we thoroughly took out into the field and learned inside and out. And it was really the kids that would show us what the app was about. You don't know the magic of an app until you hand the device to the child.
I have a very similar experience. I would do a lot of stuff with technology with my kids, and they're teaching me how to use these apps. And I think that's a mark of a good app, is that, you can pick it up. It's intuitive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the kids in school today should be teaching the teachers the tech.
Yes.
Yeah. We had a student in my private practice that he created his own iOS app, with a little bit of help. But I mean, and I think, if I recall correctly, all it did was give a quote of the day from time to time. But still, that's great. It just shows, this was a student that had a diagnosis of being on the spectrum, and he rocked that thing out in hours. So, okay, so you have a pretty broad mandate in terms of what you review. You said you have a speech language pathologist on staff. Do you go so far as into things like augmentative and alternative communication, or is this?
Oh, absolutely, right? Absolutely. We've had to change with the times, because if we didn't, we would be nowhere. We also got super excited when things came along, and I usually go to the toy fair. So when things started coming out, such as Tiggly and Marbotic, where the children had manipulatives back in their hands that interacted with the screen, as a special ed teacher myself, I was so excited that we had something for the child besides just screen time. And we really went pretty hog wild on that, and spent a lot of time with a number of those companies. We were delighted to be working with them and promoting their products.
That's such a small world. That's funny. I worked as a consultant for Tiggly, and then for Osmo, if you recall that one.
Yes,
and then also for Smart Panda, which is a little bit more recent.
Smart Panda?
Yeah, I not to plug. I'm not being paid by Smart Panda. That's any listeners, but it's you know what? And after all that, I messed it up. Did some work for Square Panda.
Okay, so did I, interestingly enough.
How funny. Yeah, I got to meet LeVar Burton through that. It was pretty neat, reading Rainbow. But anyway, I mean, part of what's been tragic for me is, as I go to the different industry conferences year and year, it seems like a lot of familiar faces will disappear. I mean, what do you think is going on for small developers in the app market? Is it feasible anymore?
Well, from what I've been seeing, your average educational app developer cannot quit their day job. And even if they get quite popular and quite big, they are not having the revenue. When you're selling an app for 99 cents, $1.99, that just does not add up, especially the cost in development is extremely high. Seeing lots of mergers, like Spin Master took over Tokaboka and Sago.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
I didn't know that either.
And Fingerprint. I don't know if you're familiar with Fingerprint.
Mm-mm.
They're based out of San Francisco, and they went to the Android platform as well and started buying people's apps that they would be using so that the app would be loaded. And some of my favorite apps went to Ansel and Clare, so they were no longer run by the developer themselves. Oh, and what's the other one? This was the very, very early on. And she ended up working for Khan Academy. They ended up taking her app. I will think of it, but it's the Itsy Bitsy Spider. It was musical. I'll think of it. I'll bring that back. But yeah, there's a lot of mergers going on. Or what I'm finding is constantly updating my site because people are going out of business and I have to take off their review because they're no longer in existence.
It's not available on the market, right? Sure. Well, and that leads me to another big question I've wondered is and I not to pry too deep into your own business model, but in our own experience with affiliate sales for iTunes, it's really not viable in terms of making a living, or maintaining a team. Do you think that's am I wrong in thinking that? Is it better with higher priced apps? Or are there, I guess, other ways to do this?
Well, I think it's changed dramatically in the sense that first it was Apple and they were everything. And you didn't know if you sold something to a school or another type of facility. You couldn't get credit for that. You really struggled with not only selling your apps, but a quote from Warren Buckleitner would be, if you think it's hard making money from apps, try making a living writing about apps.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, the subscription base is super popular now, and that I think is great. I think that's really taking over. And now that most big developers have it on all platforms, even for Chromebooks, I think that's really made everything a lot more accessible.
You said you worked a lot in special education. How do you feel about the subscription models or even in-app purchases when SPED students are involved?
Well, I think the subscription models are working for schools, but it is very difficult to get your foot into the school. And I find that most app developers, that is their biggest goal right now, is to find some way to get into the schools and make it happen that way with the subscription model.
Right.
Do you think that the subscription model kind of puts a lot of pressure on these companies to kind of keep updating and keep creating, new stuff?
Of course, you have to keep updating and adding new stuff. But what a number of them have done is you buy different components, just like the in-app purchase. So a school may choose to buy like 4 different, I'm trying to think of one in particular, and I don't want to give them a shout out, but Nearpod, who I think is really doing a great job. You can pick and choose what you're buying from different categories, and they have makers from all over. And I think that they're finding that works. And I see that in other subscription models as well, that you're not paying for the whole thing. It's an additional if you want this. It's sort of like an a la carte kind of style. So I see that working.
I would love your thoughts on what makes a great app.
Okay. Well, first, the child needs to drive the app.
Yeah, I love that.
The child also is very intuitive and does not need a lot of direction. Too many developers have a hard time putting themselves in the shoes of a 3-year-old or a
Yes.
6-year-old. And you don't need a lot of text. You just need subtle hints. And I think the subtle hints work much better than anything. I also feel very strongly that if it's a great app, it's going to have intrinsic motivation for the child, and it's going to compel them to keep playing. And too many app developers put in an abundance of bells and whistles for rewards that aren't necessary and actually can detract from the content itself, slow down the child. of course, content is always king. So yes, you need to have that. And many apps are not made by educators. They're made by either a company or a small mom and pop kind of a thing. So I think that you really need to have an educator involved in making an app, at least for the beta testing, to get some feedback from them.
Yeah, that's a great point too, because if you were to draw the Venn diagram of people that work in education and people that have computer science or engineering degrees, it's like the overlap is like bloop, there's very little there. And so I think what I've seen happen is we have large companies that'll push into our space without any real clear knowledge of what's needed by educators. But then I'll talk to educators and they'll have some brilliant idea, with no idea how to execute it. Which is too bad, and maybe that's something that'll change over time. But I do think that there's an argument. As much as I agree with you that we need more small development in the education space, I also wonder to what extent, like how, other than sites like yours, how are parents even finding, educators even finding the new apps?
Sadly enough, I find most educators are not experienced with apps, and they're not using them at all. I recently visited a public school and went in with the Curioscope t-shirt, which is an AR augmented reality that the child puts on the t-shirt, and then the app opens, and then all of a sudden you've got the anatomy. Mm-hmm. So it's a free app. Because I was giving the teacher the t-shirt, I said, you can download the free app. Let me put it on your iPad. And he goes, how do you do that? I said, well, just log into your iTunes. He goes, I don't do that.
Right.
Which seems crazy to hear in 2017.
Yeah. I was checking on a school recently, and I asked an SLP where her district iPad was, and she said, "Oh, you mean that big camera they gave me?"
Yes.
I was like,
It's a big camera.
Now Rachel actually, has a background in AR development, so it's funny that you brought that up, or augmented reality. Do you feel like it's been hard, Rachel, to sort of communicate to people what it is that is exactly?
Well, absolutely. I mean, especially with these new technologies like augmented reality, virtual reality, people can't even kind of wrap their heads around it. And that's why I always tell people, like, you have to see it. There's videos out there. So it's interesting because I think that, and we talk about this a lot, Lucas, there's a lot of early adopters when it comes to technology, but I feel like a lot more late adopters and people you kind of have to convince that, technology is not, overwhelming and scary, just try it out, see how it works. And actually, I'm interested, Jayne, to hear your take on, AR, VR, and how they're kind of changing the game as far as education apps.
Well, from what I've seen, there's been some, not a lot, but some great products come along that realize that it's a tool and you may use it to reinforce and enhance the lesson, but not necessarily be the focus of. And I think that the companies that are doing that are having a lot more success than if they're just full-blown trying to just be fancy with the tech. That's really not what we need in education. And I just wanted to say this, in order to succeed in education and to really make a difference and change education from where it is now, I think we all need to work together.
And that goes back to a theme that I harp on for, those of you who've listened to this for a while about the need for open source solutions as well, and then especially as we move towards a situation where, potentially Chromebooks are now becoming the dominant market share in the schools. It is possible to develop for multiple things at once. And I agree too that, we shouldn't be using the flashy techy thing just because it's flashy and techy, right? Even though people like me tend to get excited, but if I think there is something to be said for using a modality that's already inherently engaging to the student, right? I think it's a lot more fun, I think, to do exercises on an iPad rather than filling out like a closed worksheet or whatever it might be.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
What are you most excited for moving forward in the industry? Is there anything you're super, looking forward to?
Well, I think the possibility of being an app broker, which was impossible in the beginning because of the way the iTunes store was set up. I'm really excited about possibly starting something new and having 5 or 6 products that I would call exemplary and starting to do some professional development. It's much needed. And for a very long time, I didn't want to do it because teachers are your worst audience.
That's the whole mandate of this podcast is, I was told some time ago that by an educator that they were afraid to seek continuing education in technology because they thought that they would lose their job by admitting that they don't know about it. And that terrifies me, right? So we do this podcast at least partially to provide sort of covert continuing education for those folks. But when you say worst enemy, do you mean in terms that they are resistant?
Well, what happens is, at this point in time, since the Common Core came along, teachers have been inundated with changes and new programs and new regimes, and they've had so many things put on their plate and nothing taken away, that I understand why they're not a great audience, because here you are trying to sell them just one more thing to add to their full plate. And that's very difficult. So I understand that completely. It's just, we really need to start looking at the whole child again and get away from this overkill on assessment, working in the classroom all year long to take one silly standardized test, which really isn't going to give you a good overview. I'd like to see teachers get the respect they deserve again, because I think in the last few years, they've really been given a bad rap.
Yeah.
Jayne, what are some ways for, speech therapists and teachers that are listening to this podcast right now, what are some ways that they can kind of start becoming more comfortable with implementing technology or trying out?
Well, one thing is trying it themselves. It's always been said you're not going to go into a classroom cold and read a book to a child. You're going to read the book first,
right,
before you do that. So I would say they should be looking at some of this on their own and playing with it, but not expecting that they're going to have it all. But I think they just need to get their feet wet and not be scared. It's here to stay.
Yep. Exactly. And I always kind of try to impress upon teachers and other practitioners that there's no wrong way to kind of explore. And I feel like we have this idea that it has to be exactly what was intended by the app developer, or we have to do it in this perfect way. And we don't, it's evolving. And apps that I've used for years, I'm still kind of evolving in the way that I'm using them and how I'm targeting specific words and activities and things like that. So I just think it's
right. The teachable moments that when something comes up, you've got to say, oh, and take advantage of that.
Exactly.
Yep. Well, and then along those lines too, and I'm thinking specifically of, I know so many people that are speech language pathologists like us that use Tokaboka apps as, ways to teach cause and effect and social reciprocity and these other things. But there's not accompanying curriculum for that, right? Do you feel like it's one burden of the developers to furnish those sorts of things, at least in explicitly educational apps?
Well, there is something now called CASEL, CASEL. I don't know if you're aware of that.
No, here we go. I'm learning. This is perfect.
Okay, well, it is a laundry list of social and emotional goals. And for me, as a special ed teacher, that's where you start. You start with the whole child. You can't teach a hungry child. You can't teach a child who feels bad about themselves. So obviously, the social and emotional piece is not something new. Everybody's talking about mindset and SEL. And as a special ed teacher, we have always made sure that we worked on that component. So I think it's coming around. I'm actually doing some work right now with a company I'm doing the consulting for. They're getting out of the more edutainment into the more educational sector, and they've hired me to help them. And we're having a conference call tomorrow for me to explain to them exactly what social and emotional is and how we can incorporate that right within the context of what you're doing. It's not something separate.
Right.
It needs to be built in and just part of what you're doing.
I want to make sure that if people want to find you, where can they do that?
Teacherswithapps.com. And I wanted to be able to say this, is that we're always getting new interns, and a lot of them are college students. I would love if anyone wants to get involved. That's a great way to learn. And you can contact me very easily at Jayne at teacherswithapps.com. And we have a lot of guest contributors, and we have a lot of, I can't do this all the time, but I'd love to do it once a month. So I would just say that a shout out to your listeners that get involved. And if it's not with me, then get involved with something else.
Well, I think that's a really great opportunity because you kind of get to see the landscape, which is what I love about your site, is that, you know, as a therapist, I can kind of see what's going on. I have one place where I can go and know that it's reputable. You know, you guys are reviewing the best of the best, and that's really nice. So as a potential intern or someone kind of working with you guys or contributor, it would be great because you would kind of get the landscape of what's out there.
Right. And we love having teachers of any kind. I actually had one speech pathologist aide who wrote for years, and she was excellent. It didn't matter that she was an aide and not a certified.
No, sure. Some of our best authors have been, grad students or that type. Sure.
Exactly. Or the assistants, because they're in the field. They know because they're there every day.
Exactly. They have that implementation piece. They know, right, what is going on and what the need is.
Exactly.
Yep. And then also, building up your visibility in terms of, actual contributions made to the field. I think we all know how competitive it is to get, certainly into speech pathology, but also special education, these things, it's a good way to give yourself a leg up.
Oh, absolutely. Or it's a good way to keep your job because things are changing and we're going to need a lot more teachers in the future. And if you have a second language or you have technology, I think that that's going to really help you in your job search.
Absolutely. It's here to stay.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, there always need to be teachers. Whether or not we pay them is another question, but we're working on it. So
Exactly.
Well, there's one question we always have to ask at the end of an interview, which is, what is your most favorite recent app, education or otherwise?
Just recently, Dr. Panda. That's why
I like Dr. Panda.
That's why I asked before when you had said Smart Panda, because I've been doing some work with Dr. Panda, and they just came out with a play set that has augmented reality and manipulatives, and it's super fun, but it's got all the educational components built right in. So right now, I have to say this, I did not review it. Joe Booth, our occupational therapist, did review that app. So I don't want to take credit for reviewing it, but I think it's a great product and great for preschools. And I just love the fact that more and more we have something to go along with the screen.
Yeah, because it promotes engagement, right, and connection. It's not just a child sitting in front of a screen. It's now interactive, which is, as a speech language pathologist, that's what I love.
Right. And believe it or not, sometimes the kids get more excited about the manipulatives than the screen because that's so commonplace. But you pull out Marbonic with the alphabet, and they're like thrilled, and they start playing with the alphabet letters. So
yeah. Well, even some of the big video games coming out right now, totally outside of education, they've got the little manipulatives and these things. So. Oh,
exactly. And the robots. We didn't talk about that at all. We'll have to do that another time because that's a very big piece of what's happening is the coding. The coding is huge.
Yep.
And we didn't touch on that subject.
Yep. Well, and I, for my part, I'll use robots like the Sphero or the Wonder Workshop for students that are otherwise confined to a wheelchair because they don't get the chance to. I mean, how often does a 17-year-old with Rett syndrome get to slam the door on her parents, right? But if I have peers set up a little Minecraft city for her and then she can wreck it with a robot, it gets a little bit of that, that emotion out. So
yeah, and then they're vested in their learning.
Yeah,
absolutely.
One final thing that came up, and I hate to bring it up after we already were winding down, but I constantly get pushback from parents and for educators around screen time in education. How do you feel about that?
Well, here's what I'd like to say is that if you are the parent, you are in charge, and you can go into the device and you can set controls. You can also be very involved with the content that is on the devices. And you need to say no at some point, or have some sort of digital citizenship agreement with your child. And you need to be involved, because I've seen people I've seen people at conferences raising their hand saying, I don't know how to get my child off Minecraft. I'm like, you are the parent.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, thanks so much for your time. I'm so glad to have you here, Jayne Clare from Teachers with Apps. If you'd like more information about her or her site, of course, you can visit teacherswithapps.com. You can also always go to tech.speechscience.org. But thanks once again for joining us. This has been a great experience. I think it's really going to help a lot of our listeners, and I look forward to communicating with you again in the future.
My pleasure. Thanks so much. I enjoyed it.
Well, welcome back once again to Talking with Tech. This is Lucas Stuber, joined by Rachel Madel and Chris Begay. I thought that was a great conversation. I learned a lot about a lot of apps, and I thought I knew about a lot of apps. So eye-opening for me. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I love Jayne. She's fantastic, and her website's very thorough and such a great resource. One of the worst things about apps is they're constantly coming out with new ones, and it's so hard to stay on top of what's new and what's great. She takes out all the legwork for you.
I totally love the idea that there's a place you can review apps, so you don't have to do it all on your own. That there's some people have already done the work for you, like Rachel said. It's the best.
Well, we want to hear what you think. So track us down on Facebook. Put a post in the group. Tell us what apps you've been using, what apps you like, maybe some apps that you're critical of. We'd love to have a conversation, about that. Share that knowledge with the group. Also, please go to tech.speechscience.org, and we'll have a link to Jayne's website, as well as some links out to some of the specific things that we discussed in terms of tools that you can use with your students or for yourself. And as far as a winner, I would say that both Rachel and Chris won for putting up with me today. That's the winner. I think I'm at -3. But if you're at -3, I think that means Slytherin wins, right? Isn't that the rule? Or no? If that's right, if Slytherin is winning, then Dumbledore shows up and makes sure that Gryffindor wins.
I know what I'm doing this weekend. I'm gonna rewatch Harry Potter so I can stay up to speed.
Yeah. Sad thing is, I actually just rewatched them when I was working. I'm one of those people that works with the TV on in the background, and because of that, I have no idea what happened in the movies. But anyway, one last favor we'd ask of you guys. We put a lot of time and heart and soul into trying to share this information with you guys. You notice we really don't do a lot of advertising. We make most of our money, what little of it we do through Patreon, which I encourage you to check out, patreon.speechscience.org. It's just like a public radio type model. You can give us $1, you can give us $5, whatever works for your budget. But what would be really helpful is if you go to iTunes and give us a rating and a review, because that'll help more people to find us. And we know for a fact that people are out there looking for training content on augmentative communication and educational technology. And the more people see us, the better we look. The more likely they are to listen. So with that said, we appreciate every moment that we have with you guys, and we look forward to talking to you next week.
Expecto Patronum.